Hi guys, welcome back. It's Katie here. I am a criminal defense attorney and I wanted to make this video to follow up on another video about why I told you should never speak to the police when you're read your rights. And a lot of people had some follow-up questions about what you can do in a situation where you're talking to a police officer or law enforcement, but they didn't read your rights yet. Can you still lawyer up? And what does that even mean? What if you don't have a lawyer? So there's a little bit of the before and after that I wanted to hit on because I think it's super important. So in my last video, and as we all know, the rule is if a cop reads you your rights, and by your rights, I mean your Miranda rights, you have the right to remain silent, you have the right to speak to an attorney, anything you say can and will be used against you. We've all heard that. When you're at that point in an interaction with a police officer, I think we all know by now that you do not talk to them any further. You tell them, I don't want to talk to you, I want to speak to a lawyer. So that's what we mean when we're talking about invoking your rights. So that potential scenario is obvious. But what about if you're just called in to speak to the police, or even if they come to your house and they just want to talk to you casually and they're kind of going through the conversation and maybe even just kind of small talking, not even talking about anything in particular? Can you invoke your rights then, or when are they going to read your rights? So this is kind of a good question, and a lot of people had it. And the way that you determine whether a police officer should or shouldn't have read you your rights is what they call whether you were in custody at the time. So that determination is sometimes a little bit tricky, and it's something that's left up to the courts to determine maybe down the line if a police officer should have read your rights, but they didn't. But for all intents and purposes, if you're speaking to a police officer and essentially you're free to leave, even though it might not feel like it, then they don't have to read your rights because you're not considered to be in custody. So in those cases, you have to be very careful because you're not being read your rights, but you could still say something incriminating, right? So you have every right, number one, to just leave if you don't want to talk to them anymore, even if they haven't read your rights at all. And number two, to tell them just straight up, I don't want to talk to you, I'm going to speak to an attorney first, even if you haven't been read your rights. Now, of course, you kind of have to use common sense in terms of, hey, what is this scenario? Like, did I witness a crime that I'm totally unrelated to? Or did I call the police myself to help me with something? So obviously in those cases, you're going to want to talk to the officers and try to help them out. But if it's any situation where you may be accused of something, or you feel like you could be accused, or maybe even if you're not being accused, but you know something that they don't know that could implicate you later, be very careful about how you interact with a police officer, even when they haven't read your rights yet. So that's what I wanted to point out. And it's a long conversation and there's lots of different nuances about when someone's in custody versus when they're not. But the bottom line is that even if you haven't been read your rights, you have no obligation to speak to law enforcement, and you really shouldn't talk to them if it's something that you could even potentially be implicated with. So some of the ways that this comes up in real life, not necessarily during an ongoing investigation, maybe it's a traffic stop, or maybe there's some sort of incident in public and there's police that are there and they approach you, you're not obligated to answer their questions. And if you are approached by an officer and they start asking you personal questions about your day, for instance, you can tell them, sorry, I'm not going to answer your questions, or I'm not going to discuss my day. There's lots of things you can do to just tell them you're not going to speak to them, respectfully, of course. And I always tell people that, there's no reason to say this in a way that's aggressive. You just say, I'm not going to answer questions, I want to speak to a lawyer. If, of course, it comes to that point. Now, the other thing that's important about any interaction with law enforcement is whether or not you're actually being detained or whether you're free to go. And the simple way to figure this out is to ask the officer if it's getting to a point in the conversation where they seem to want to continue to talk to you. You can say, am I being detained or am I free to go? And if they tell you that you are being detained, then they may at that point need to read your rights, or you may need to stay for a bit longer, of course, because that's what they're doing, during a traffic stop and things of that sort. However, if they tell you you're free to go, then you should go. A lot of times it's hard to figure out just based on the nature of the conversation, because the police are trained to say things that make it feel like you don't have a choice. But the only way to find out if you do is to really ask them. So those are important things to keep in mind when you're interacting with officers. Now, I don't want this to sound like police are all out to get you and that there's never any good intention. Of course, that's not the point. The point is you're protecting yourself and you're not trying to create problems by inadvertently giving information that you really don't have to and you really shouldn't. So that's what this is for. And I think that once you are kind of seeing these scenarios in real life, you'll see really clearly the point in time where things kind of cross over and could have gone a different direction if somebody had stopped talking. So that's something I did want to cover because there are lots of times when you're not read your rights. So be careful, tread carefully, and you'll be putting yourself in a good position if things do progress, and you won't have created a bigger problem for yourself. Okay, so that's kind of the before of the rights advisement. Now I wanted to talk about what about afterwards. A lot of people ask me, you say, hey, tell them you want to talk to a lawyer. What if I don't have a lawyer? What if I can't even afford a lawyer? Or, okay, I told them I wanted a lawyer, and then I sat there and they never brought me a lawyer. So what's going on with that? So this is kind of a common area of misconception, I think. When you are questioned by law enforcement and you tell them, I don't want to speak to you, I want a lawyer, you can say those words even if you don't have a lawyer, even if you don't know if you can afford a lawyer, and even if you never actually end up getting a lawyer, okay? So when you tell them, I want to speak to a lawyer, that ceases questioning. That doesn't mean that you have a lawyer, or that you're saying you have a lawyer, or that you're getting a lawyer, or that they're going to give you a lawyer, because that's not going to happen. So the important thing is, in the moment of the interaction with the police, you tell them you want a lawyer, and then that will cease the interrogation. They may have to wrap up some administrative things, but they will let you go at that point. And then it's up to you how you end up getting a lawyer, if you do. And some people are entitled to free counsel, depending on what jurisdiction they're in and all of these other sort of factors. Other people may decide to talk to a lawyer and hire them privately. And then some people will say, I don't need a lawyer. But the bottom line is, you don't have to have that all figured out at the point when you're telling them, I want a lawyer. Those are the magic words. You do need to say that during an interrogation, and you need to say it regardless of whether you have a lawyer or you're ever going to have a lawyer. And depending on what happens, that you may or may not need one. But at least in that moment, you've stopped the questioning. So I hope that clarifies a few more of those factors about being questioned by law enforcement. I'm going to make some more videos about different types of scenarios, traffic stops, things of that sort, where it's a little more ambiguous about how compliant you need to be, how cooperative, do you need to give some information or not? So we'll talk about that, and let me know what other questions you have and what else you want to hear about. Happy New Year. Bye.